Okay, so our next kingdom, well, we've done Monarans, and then we did Protista, and we did fungi. So we're going to go ahead and start on the next kingdom, the Animalia. Well, there's also the plants, but we'll come back to plants. All right, so Animalia, the animals. We're going to look at their characteristics first. They are eukaryotic, which you should know what that means by now. They are multicellular. And you should know the difference between multicellular and colonial, because we saw that some of the Protista were colonial. They are heterotrophic. If you recall, that means that they are other feeding. They don't use like photosynthesis to get food from the sunlight to make food. They have to go out and get their own food somehow. Okay. They have an embryonic development, so there is development from the conception, from the egg and the sperm through to the form, such as a baby. So they share all that. It's going to be different for different animals, but yes. And they have some sort of symmetry or asymmetry. Symmetry meaning one type is bilateral, which means you can cut it in half and the left side looks like the right side. So a bilateral symmetry. Okay, we'll look at that right now. All right, so asymmetry, A means not, we know that, so no symmetry. That would be something that no matter how you decide to try to cut it, you don't get mirror images of each other in any way. The bilateral, which is what we have, and radiosymmetry would be, think of a sea star, a sunflower, an umbrella. If you stick a pole through the center and you look down on it, it's all similar. That's radiosymmetry. It's kind of around a central point. Okay, so those are the main characteristics of the Animalia. Now we're going to start with what we would consider the simplest, the animals. We will also be looking eventually at how this is all laid out. I don't think I have it drawn out in the notes here, so I'll show you that later. All right, so our first phylum then, remember kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. We're going to have to break this kingdom down because it's so huge. So the first phylum we're looking at are the Porifera. And again, you'll see that there's going to be similarities in how I go through these notes. Okay, just like we did with the fungi, we broke it down and we looked at some of the same things about it, so you can compare some of these things. All right, so phylum Porifera, there are about 9,000 species, not too shabby. Their basic structure, they are considered the simplest of the animals. They are sessile. Now, that's a new word for you. Sessile means they do not move around. They're kind of they're stuck in one place. All right, so that's sessa. They stay in one place. They don't move around. Now that seems kind of weird when we're talking about animals, but it is the case. They have 2 cell layers. Okay, that seems really weird. There's only 2 cell layers. They have pores. Think about it. You have pores. Pores are little holes. And they're all over the little critter. They have something called a spongicle. Which would be kind of like an inside cavity. Because coelom, cavity. We'll be seeing that a little bit later on in a couple of the other phyla too. That's going to come up. An osculum, which is a larger opening, larger than the pores, and water flows out the osculum. The mesohele is, it's kind of like a glue or a substance that holds the cell layers together. Keeps everything in place. There are some special cells, and you know this word means cells because it has cyte on it, cyto, cell, and they're called amoebocytes. Now you know what a cell is. You know what an amoeba is. So does that mean they have little amoebae living inside of them? No. It's just that the cell kind of functions, does some of the same things that an amoeba would as far as obtaining food for the sponge. Something called spicules, if you think about it, like little spikes, spicules. We have a skeleton for support. Sponges don't. They have the little spicules or little spikes in them that give them support. We'll look at this also. And something called a collar cell, which is really kind of cute in a way. It does have like a little collar or material around the top of it, and then a little flagellum that sticks out. Now we will actually draw a picture of this, and we will describe how this all works together. All right, most of the sponges that are out there live in oceans, they're marine organisms. They have found some that do live in fresh water, okay? But for the most case, it is marine. Their nutrition, they are filter feeders. Remember, they are sessile, so they're not going to be moving around to go eat things. They are stuck in one place. So basically the food has to come to them. All right, so without having a diagram, here's a little explanation of what happens. The sponge is sitting there, and it's covered in pores, those little holes. The pores allow water to flow into the sponge. And the water flows into the spongicle, which is basically the inner cavity. If you think about it, a very rough analogy, a sponge is almost kind of like a vase. You have the opening at the top, but in this case, the vase would have little holes all over, little pores all over the sides and everything. So the water flows into the pores, and as it does so, it's bringing any tiny little critters, your protista and things, into the sponge. Then, once the water gets inside, it has to be moved up through the sponge and out the osculum. So you got this constant flow in and out. Well, in order to get the water to keep moving through the spongiocele, you have those little collar cells which are waving their little flagellum, and they're moving. It helps to move the water out, but it also helps to catch any little food particles that are in the water. And then that passes to the amoebocytes, which then pass food to the rest of the sponge. Pretty cool. So water in through pores, out the osculum, and in that process the amoebocytes grab the food out of the water to feed the sponge. Okay. Reproduction. They are what we call hermaphroditic. Hermaphroditic means that they produce both eggs and sperm. Okay? They do not fertilize themselves. They will produce the eggs, they will produce the sperm. And my understanding is that the sperm are what move on. They go out with the water, out the osculum, and hopefully another sponge will draw that water with the sperm in it into the pores, and then it'll fertilize the eggs of a different sponge. It's my understanding. Okay. So we're going to come back to this thing on filter feeders a little later. I want to actually, we want to talk about both of these and some benefits and problems with this type of nutrition and reproduction. Okay, something fantastic for sponges is the fact that they can regenerate. That means they can grow parts back. And kind of found this out the hard way for humans. I believe the story goes something that the sponges, they didn't like the sponges. This happened with sea stars too. So you cut up the sponges, you realize, oh, I had one sponge, I cut it into 10 pieces, now I have 10 sponges. So they learn that they can actually multiply in that way also. All right. Our example, well, we just put the sponge because that's what they are. Their importance, the real sponges were used for cleaning, and you could probably still get a few for that. They can use them for decoration. All right, so that's sponges. That's the phylum Porifera. We're going to move on to the second phylum. Moving up. Cnidaria. Cnidaria. Do not pronounce the C. It's Cnidaria. All right. And you're going to see where this name comes from. 10,000 plus species. Structure. Now, remember the Porifera were 2 cell layers. The Cnidaria are a little more complex. They are not just 2 cell layers, they are 2 tissue layers. Now remember, the difference between tissues and cells is you can have different types of cells coming together to make up a tissue, working a little bit more together, okay? Like muscle tissue and all that. All right, so there's two tissue layers. You have the epidermis, so derma meaning like skin, so kind of the outer layer, the outer skin. Then you have something called the gastrodermis, dermis, skin, gastro, like your stomach. You think gastrointestinal, that's your digestive tract in there. So those are your two tissue layers. Then you have the mesoglia. Meso, middle. Glia refers to glue, so middle glue. This mesoglia is kind of like the mesohil. It holds the two tissues together. All right. They have only one opening, which seems like you're kind of going backwards because the porifera had two. They had an in and an out, and the cnidarians only have one opening. It opens into the gastrovascular cavity, which you might think of as kind of like the sponge's seal, that central cavity. But gastrovascular, like a stomach. So stomach. And I tend to think of these guys just as a fun way to remember them as like little floating stomachs out there. They have tentacles surrounding the opening into the gastrovascular cavity. Now, how many tentacles they have is going to depend on the species that you're talking about. But what's important to know is that on these tentacles, not all of them, but a lot of them, you have cells called cnidocytes, cnidarian, cnido, and cyto. So these are stinging cells. So if any of you have ever been stung by a jellyfish, you know what I'm talking about. All right, you were hit with one of the nematocysts from a cnidocyte. And the nematocyst is actually kind of a wrapped up little harpoon type of thing. And when you brush up against the cnidocytes, there's a trigger on there, and it releases the little harpoon, which can wrap, and it can it'll stick and wrap. Well, that's how they catch their food. So they do actually have nerve and muscle tissue. They don't, as far as I know, they don't have what they would consider a true brain at this point. So we're not looking that complex, all right? We're just looking at the idea that there actually is, though, some nerve and muscle tissue there, which allows them, with the muscle tissue, to have some control over their movement in the water. They aren't totally subject to the water currents. They can have a little bit of control. All right, there are two stages to their lives. Which one is dominant? Just again, it's going to depend on the species. The polyp is the sessile form. We already know what sessile means now. So a polyp will stay in one place. And like with a hydra, something called a hydra, we'll see one. That's the main form that you see, and they are cute little things, so we'll see some of those. Then there's the Medusa form, which is the motile, meaning moving form. And when you think of a jellyfish, that's the Medusa form. That's what you're seeing. Okay? So that's more the dominant, if you want to say that, the dominant form for those organisms. All right. Habitats, marine, and there are some freshwater versions, like the hydra's a freshwater one. A lot of your jellyfish are marine, although I want to say I have heard, and I would have to double check this, I think they have found some freshwater jellyfish, but I would have to double check again just to be positive on that. All right. Nutrition, ooh, they are carnivores. And a carnivore eats meat. All right, so they are meat eaters. They're going to eat other critters out there. And again, how do they do that? Well, remember the tentacles with the nematocysts and all. So, here, as for example, you got your little jellyfish floating around out there, and a fish comes along and brushes up against the tentacles. The trigger is set off. He gets stung, and he's paralyzed, and he's brought up into the gastrovascular cavity, where he is digested. And then when the jellyfish has absorbed the nutrients and gotten what it can from the fishy, then he throws it back out, what he doesn't want. In the opening, out the opening. So food in, trash out, same opening. Okay. All right, as far as reproduction, it is sexual. Again, you will have sperm and eggs released. And then some species do have an asexual. Remember the difference between sexual and asexual. You should know this. With the asexual, there is a form called budding. And we see this with the hydra. In the hydra, what can happen is that it reminds me of the yeast when they bud. So, you know, you have a little hydra and it's doing its thing, and it can actually grow a little baby hydra on the side of it, and that's its bud. That's what they call budding. And that little baby one will eventually, when it gets to a certain point, it can pop off the parent hydra and do its thing, find a little place to settle down and live. All right, so that's budding. That's an asexual form. All right, example would be, one example of this phylum are the jellyfishes. the corals, the hydra. We will look at all of these. Again, hydra, freshwater corals, marine. And like I said, we'll go into a little bit more detail about each of these just because they're interesting. The sea anemone is the other one. So we have jellyfishes, hydra, coral, sea anemone for our examples. Importance of this particular phylum: they, like the corals, they do build reefs, which we will, again, we'll go back and refer to this, but think about it, the reefs in themselves, the coral reefs, are basically fantastic habitats for thousands of animals and plants and other things that live there. So very important, and very fragile too. By doing this, they do provide homes for other animals. So that's some importance. All right, that takes care of those notes for right now.